Hello, fellow artists, and welcome to the premiere episode of Ted Does Art, not to be confused with Ted Talks Art by my alter ego. Anyway, so in this first demo, I've entitled it Hero's Ride, is you see me sketching up this sort of creature, this steed, being ridden by these two protagonists, a couple characters that I've designed previously for a new project I'm working on. And these days, for the past, half year or so, there's a certain kind of pipeline I've been doing. It's a combination of quick sketching, quick design passes, as quick as I can be in terms of tones and painting, but keeping that kind of sketch mentality because I'm just trying to be efficient with the time that I have to spare, and also tackling things that I can get done in a manageable amount of time. So here you see me doing different iterations of blocking rather, and also the nice thing about Photoshop and utilizing some of the distort tools and all that. You just have to be careful with that though, because it's not perfect and you should still end up redrawing afterwards. Now you see to the left those characters that I've done already in the past, earlier a couple months ago or so, and I've put down the head scale there just to give me a reference, because these are supposed to be the same characters that I'm drawing again here in this composition, I guess. And one thing I tell my students is no one cares about how you got there or how many takes, how many attempts. All they care about is the result. A lot of times there seems to be this unspoken rule or goal. Try to get this drawing done with as few mistakes as possible or without an underdrawing. It's nice to be able to do that, but no one ever really sets out to do that. It's just a matter of getting better at what you're doing, being efficient. But if it's not working out, then just take more stabs at, even if it's just one area of the drawing. What you see me here is just kind of quickly Frankensteining that other art onto this, just as a guide. It's not perfect, but this just helps me be consistent with the look and proportions and things like that. And a lot of times it's not really necessary to be 100% accurate or like verbatim repeat everything to a T, but just essentially get the majority of it so it's believable that this looks like the same person. And again, kind of sketching through thoughts and ideas here, combining that with using layers, in some cases resizing. Now these are just all tools, and especially coming from a concept art background, of using your time wisely. Like you don't want to waste time on something and reserve that for something that you need for later in the stage of the art, whether it's in the paint or the cleanup or whatever it may be. But at the same time not be a slave to any given type of approach. But just it's more a matter of workflow. What works for you, what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you, and vice versa. But you have to kind of approach it in a way that helps you. What works best for you to keep your work fluid and keep you productive, and help maintain that basically the fun factor, the joy in producing and drawing this thing. So now I'm moving on to the female character, Jinmei. And I'm doing the same thing here where I'm Frankensteining the previous art just as a quick reference, a quick guide. And, typically when it comes to drawing gender, artists usually gravitate towards one or are stronger at or have an easier time at one gender as opposed to the other. And it's for one of two reasons. So if you are better at drawing the same gender, it's because, well, you relate to that. If you're, in my case, it's true. I have an easier time drawing male figures because, well, I'm male, so you can relate to that. Now, if you are better at drawing the opposite gender, it's usually because you find that more interesting to draw. So if you're a male artist who prefers and is better at drawing female, or vice versa, that's usually because you have stronger interest in that subject matter. So here you see me now kind of quickly blacklining the characters. And once in a while you'll see me kind of flip it, and many of you have heard of the flip test, where it fools the eye, and sometimes you get tunnel vision because you start to not recognize certain errors. So when you flip it, that helps, especially when it comes to the eyes and the face. The eyes might look okay in the direction that you're drawing, and as soon as you flip it, you notice that they're incorrect. Now I'm moving on to this kind of steed here, and one thing to take note is it's important to kind of plan things together. You notice that I didn't, only do the characters and not even bother doing a quick rough of the creature, and that's because you want to ensure that they go well together. You want to ensure that the character feels like it is actually resting on this character or on this creature. So here's several design iterations, especially on the head. Not a true approach to concept art, because the key is with concept art you're doing a lot of iteration. But in this case, because this is kind of a free-form thing and I'm sort of doing it at my leisure, but at the same time with a purpose, because I am compiling this for my next book. So I do a little bit of design iteration, but I don't go crazy with it because that's not what my goal is in this case. It's basically, the way I'm viewing it is it's a step up from a sketchbook. Okay. Obviously I'm cleaning up the lines a bit more and I start painting, but my mentality is try to be fairly efficient with this and not spend too much time on any given aspect, whether it's drawing it, designing it, painting it. Typically, like let's say it's just one character, then I'm trying to nail this thing down in anywhere from 1 to 3 hours max, right? So something I can easily do at some point during the day, and then the next day I can do something new. So that's how I'm approaching it. So now you see me here experimenting a little bit with their outfits. I'm not following exactly the design that I did in a previous version of it, just to keep it fresh, keep it fun. And so you see me now exploring with the headdress and things like that. Now I'm adding the rest of the saddle here. And the way I approach it is the form of any given creature or figure is essentially stripped down, right? Anything extra, whether it's clothing or armor or fur or horns, I consider those accessories. So once you have the general form, it's much easier to place those things so they don't look like they're floating or they're in an incorrect perspective. And that's key. If you find that your character looks pretty good at the beginning, but as soon as you start adding accessories, it looks strange. A lot of times we're not understanding the form underneath it, or there wasn't enough form there to begin with, and you went straight into drawing the armor with the head without knowing what the body looks like underneath. For me, it's just much easier to do it this way, just to get the general form first, and then add accessories and accoutrements after, as you saw me earlier do with even the reins on this creature's head. So now I'm kind of tightening up the creature's line work here. And I have this great brush set that I bought. You can see in the corner here. This is for Clip Studio Paint. And there's some great brushes out there. Flyland is another good one. And this one is called the Greasel pencil. So I'm kind of keeping a little bit of this pencil sketch quality to it, even though this is all done digitally. And that's what I mean why I'm kind of having this kind of sketch mentality, even though I'm taking it a little further than just a simple pencil sketch. And that may change. It's just you want to keep something fresh every time you move on to something new, a new project, whatever it may be. But I'll be working in this mode for probably the rest of this year, as my goal is to put enough content out for this next book. My first book that I released, Kieran Prophecy, is about 84 pages. This one, the way I'm thinking is probably 130 or so. So I'm going to be in this kind of mode for a while and hopefully getting faster at it as time goes by. So, so I have the first black line sketch, which was done with a digital pencil brush. You can see it on the left there. It's called Fine Pencil, the hard setting. And then I do this kind of overall pass with this thicker Greasel pencil to give it some weight. And I'm somewhat selective. I won't do it on every area. And that gives it a little more of a organic quality to it. And so here I'm finishing up the final lines for this. And generally that's how I approach all my work, and this is what I encourage my students to do, is make sure at any stage of the process, whether it's a gesture, a volume, line work, tones, that you do the entire subject first before you move on. Because typically, especially when we're first starting out, I think we've all gone through this, where you tend to just focus on what you prefer. Like, oh, I want to draw this character, but instead of drawing a gesture out for the whole thing, I'm just going to start on the face. And on the face, I'm not even going to block out the general area of the head and the eyes. I'm going to just start working on that one eye and unto completion with shading and everything. It looks awesome. But what happens is when you go to the next eye, you struggle with it. It's not matching, or you, especially if you do it on the next day or something, or some time has passed. The reason it doesn't match or go well together, it's because they weren't planned together. So that's what I always do. It just saves a lot of hassle and it keeps it consistent. So what you see me doing now is just quickly blocking in the flats, and that's what I'll do for again, the whole drawing. So it's not just the flats for one character and start shading. It's the flats for both characters as well as the steed. And so that's another example. I said until completion, that stage across all objects on the scene. And the reason for doing flats, and you've probably seen in other artist demos, is it's much easier to plan your shading when you have your flats, because this is essentially giving an idea of how it's reading based on just the flat tones. Is it reading correctly? Are the objects separated? Can I identify and separate between the characters and the creature? The other thing is when you're ready to start shading, that ensures that you're using the proper level of shade, right? If that dark gray or almost black that you see there, I'll literally have to use black to get a shade that's darker than that. But do I need to use black for the skin? No, the skin is quite a bit lighter. So this is another way to avoid a common issue where people will do even very realistic shading, and yet the values will bleed and it will feel flat. And the reason it feels flat is because it's the same level of light and shadow across everything. The darkness and shadow and lighting of the skin is exactly the same as the armor, is exactly the same as the stone, and that's why it doesn't read well. But when you use flats first, this ensures that your shadow, your level of shadow and the level of your light is the appropriate tone, and it makes it much easier to start doing any shading. And it doesn't mean you can't change it along the way, because you're always trying to provide something that your eye can see, so you have something to compare it to. So as I get further onto this, I will start tweaking the flats even a little bit. And after I start shading, I'll start to tweak those, because then after I've done a certain enough of work, and now I can actually see how it's looking, then it makes it easier to do some adjustments rather than trying to do everything at the same time. And that's what can be difficult, right? The most daunting thing is this blank canvas. But if you're trying to go from a complete blank canvas to right into detailing, drawing and shading and coloring, for most of us that's too difficult. So we work in stages, and each stage you're helping yourself to get to the next stage. It's like playing a video game, right? You really want to get to that end boss, but you got to start from level 1 and acquire the skills and acquire the comfort and consistency of the gameplay to now be ready and level up and get the equipment to finally be ready to take on that boss. And this is no different. You're working up to get to that final stage that you see in your mind's eye that what this piece is going to look like with color and everything, and but you work your way up, starting with a simple gesture. So here I'm now at the tone stage, and these days the way I work, and it keeps it pretty fast and fluid, is I sample that given flat that I've already established, and I pick a shade darker to do one shadow pass, and I pick a shade brighter to do a light pass. And that's it. And I just do that for every aspect of it. And this allows me to get some quick tones, something farther along than a simple graphic flat style, but nothing as cumbersome or drawn out or time consuming as some really realistic shades or tones. This is a little bit of both. And because, as you can see, it's quite stylized, I can get away with not having to necessarily have to do a very realistic rendering. Because quite frankly, I get bored, right? And the way, especially concept artists, are so used to designing something and moving on to the next, very rarely do we finish up or polish something, in most cases. So the way to kind of tackle that is, let's say you do want some rendering, well, get faster at it, essentially. And so that's pretty much how I'm approaching it, is what's the quickest way that I can get some tones here that goes beyond just a simple flat style and has some actual gradation and rendering, but such that I don't have to spend too much time on it and I can move on to the next thing. Because as I mentioned at the top of the video, is that I have this kind of sketch mentality right now and trying to get everything done in a timely manner that I can accomplish in my spare time on a given day and allow me to complete something on an almost daily basis, or at least within a day. But it's not like, oh, I did 8 hours in that day. And typically I'm trying to keep it to between 1 to 3 hours. This one in total took a little longer because it's essentially 3 different things I'm doing, 2 characters and the creature. So this probably took about 6 to 8 hours, but again, not on a single day. This is probably spread across two or 3 days at most, right? So in order to get these done in my spare time, and typically late in the evening. So what I'm doing now, I think I'm kind of I've decided to separate the flats, because at this point everything was all together, the character and the steed, and I've decided to separate them because later on I will use those same flats as a wand selection to apply my color, and it just makes it easier, so I can at least have a little more control. That reminds me, in terms of use of layers and folders, typically with digital art, most artists, myself included, when you're first starting, tend to use a gazillion layers and folders. And usually the reason is it's a combination of some insecurity and uncertainty. And what I mean by that is, in the back of my mind, I think, well, what if I want to change this thing? It'll be easier if it's on its separate layer. Chances are 90% of the layers we have there we never end up touching. But you waste time because it's breaking up the flow of your work. Even if you're trying to search for something, you spend unnecessary minutes find that correct layer, especially if you don't organize it well. Is it layer 73 or is it layer 51? I can't remember. But the way I work, and eventually what happens is you reduce the amount of layers, in some cases just even using one layer and working and approaching it like a traditional artist. If someone is painting traditionally and they make a mistake, what do? They wait for it to dry and paint over it. And at least in this case, even if you're working one layer and digitally, you don't have to wait for it to dry. You just work over it, erase it, or what have you. But in this case, when I still do use layers, but it's already because I know how I'm going to use them in the future. Not, oh, what if I want to change something? So for example, I always keep the flats on a separate layer because I know later on in the pipeline, I'm going to use those flats to quickly select areas to punch in color. And that saves me a lot of time as opposed to lassoing each area or painting it by hand. So the actual coloring process is super fast. It doesn't take long at all because the way I work is, and many of you probably also work, is setting up the values, right? If it reads clearly in grayscale, then color is an easy afterthought, more or less. But if you find that your art is very hard to read in black and white, that means the values are amiss, right? The level of shadow to light is not reading very well. So what happens is when I put color on, I don't use soft light or overlay or things like that. I use color blending mode. And for a while, Clip Studio Paint, which used to be called Manga Studio, didn't have that. Only Photoshop had it. But so sometimes I would do that in Photoshop, and then once I'm at a later stage and I want to do some touch-ups in Paint, I bring it back to Clip Studio Paint because I like this particular brush that mimics Corel Painter, has a slight blend to it. But Clip Studio Paint now has, for a while now, does have many of the same blending modes, layer modes that Photoshop has. So it does have color blend mode now. So I use that, and the reason for that is the color reacts to the grayscale underneath, right? So if I just drop a solid red and then put it in color blending mode, darker areas will have a deeper red, lighter areas will have a brighter red, and it's just reacting to the level of value underneath it. If there's white, then you don't see any red. If there's black, true black, you don't see any red. Overlay and soft light, hard light do that as well, but they manipulate the values. Typically, the higher grade you go, right, from soft light to hard light to vivid light, what happens is your darks get darker and your lights get brighter, and it completely changes the values. So you got to be very careful when you use those modes. It's not right or wrong. Everyone has a different preference. Some like to use burn and dodge. The key is being very aware of your values. That's really what it's about. And then work the way you want to work. So this is just the way I work. So what you see me doing here is I like what I call is earn your shortcuts. After I've done the first pass on the shadows, I duplicate everything and I set it on like multiply or screen mode, and I mask it out to start adjusting the tones. And then afterwards, I do a global pass where you saw me a little earlier, duplicate the whole thing again and do it on multiply and then unmask just a slight gradient towards the bottom because it would be darker there, and do another layer on screen and unmask a little bit from the top, and just a general global lighting pass. So what that does is ensures that not only do your objects read well separately with their values and light, but it's still following consistent kind of fact that they're all under the same light source, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say, the underneath the arm would be darker than the top, right? But because that's higher than the leg, then that also should be a little bit brighter as a whole, right? So you have to do these general passes on your values across the objects separately as well as them as an entire composition. So here's what I mean, where the coloring process is super quick. It's just a solid color, and I'm using the flat layer and just using the wand selection to quickly select that part of the body and fill it with color, and then switch it to color blend mode, and it's reacting to the shadow and light underneath. So it's pretty fast. So the challenging part in this one is because I have several things going on with two characters and this creature, I do need to kind of adjust and play around with color choice as well as saturation, how deep or how desaturated color is. On the creature here, I'm doing a kind of subtle secondary color just to make it a little more interesting, maybe a little more believable, and that is this kind of pinkish red, which is opposite to this green color. And then once I have that, I will do the same approach with the characters. So here I'm doing my pass on the skin tones, and again, very fast. Just dump a solid color on there. I'm not painting and shading with color because it's already been done on the grayscale or the value stage, and just switch the layer setting to color blend mode, and there you can see it react to the shading underneath. Trying to use some consistent colors on both characters, but not necessarily exactly mirroring it the same way. Like her top is red, but for him I'm only accenting certain things with red. And that, in addition to, you see the same symbol on their chest, this also kind of shows that they're part of the same, guild or same kingdom or country or whatever it may be. And that also, but the other thing is it's just easier. When you introduce too many colors, it's challenging. And in most cases, when you look at a lot of art out there, you don't necessarily use a lot of colors. It's what I call different scales in the visual equalizer, right? So if you have a lot of detail or a lot of objects or a lot of shading, that's high on the visual equalizer. So color choice or saturation might be very low, so it doesn't look too busy. For example, if you look at something that's very, very stylized, very cartoony and simple with no shading, very simple shapes, they tend to have more color choices and brighter because that's higher up on the visual equalizer. Here I'm doing this really kind of charcoal or quick kind of brushstroke sketch pass to give it that kind of more sketch quality that I'm doing for this series of art pieces that I've been doing for the last little while. And again, to kind of give it a little bit of that pencil or traditional feel to it, but it's very subtle. And then I change it and put it on a soft light or setting so on lighter areas that stroke won't be too dark, and on darker areas it'll still show up. So you can see there it's reduced a little bit, so it's just a little more subtle. So the eyes have it, right? Eyes are window to the soul. So here I'm fixing up, cleaning up the eyes a little bit so they read a little better. And you see me do that flip test because it's not as noticeable if the eyes are off. And clearly I see, oh, they look a little cross-eyed or the wrong direction. So going back and forth is helpful. Just be careful about not going crazy with it and constantly flipping back and forth because that can kind of stall you as well. Just enough to fix what you're looking for. So here you see me doing a global tint, right? I do like a 5 to 10%, typically 5% pass of a one color going across the whole thing. That's equivalent to like someone who works in oils and dabs a little red into every color they're using, and that keeps it consistent, right? If you're having cool colors and warm colors, but the overall atmosphere tone is cooler, then you're putting a little bit of blue into everything. Right, so that's what I'm doing here. And I do that several times because now I'm introducing this very simple environment, or hinting at an environment, just to kind of solidify and place the characters. I'm not going for a full composition here. That's not really my goal. But I'm not trying to just simply do a pin-up where you see a character with nothing behind it. So that's why I'm doing a little bit of a background here just to place the characters in the scene and giving it a little something extra. So I've got the rock face here. I'm adding some quick kind of grass, and here you see me flipping between color and grayscale, and it's like a desaturation test. And an easy way to do that is make a layer, fill it with black, and put it on saturation blend mode. And what that does is cancel out all the colors to see how everything's reading. Now that green grass was reading pretty well, but just to be sure, when I put it in grayscale, I'll notice, oh, it's starting to fade and blend into the rock. That means that the levels were exactly the same. So that's why you see some of the grass is darker in areas where I need to stand out more. There you see me, I did a quick kind of flower petal and then reuse them to make a flower, and then a source for the art, and then at a larger scale. And that tightens it up when I shrink it down, and then reuse them for these little flowers. Right, just to add a little something extra. The funny thing is, just when I was making that large flower, my daughter came and she goes, "Ooh, that's pretty. I love the pink." So something just to kind of contrast, especially how aggressive the creature is, right? Having little things like flowers and adds a little visual interest. Here's a quick cast shadow where I just duplicate everything I've done so far and reduce it to black and use some scale and distort to do a quick shadow pass. Here you see me do another global tint across everything because now I've introduced this environment, right? So adding a little bit, in this case I decided to go with kind of a pink tinge to it, kind of harmonizes everything. And there is quite a bit of this kind of purple and blue spectrum in here, but you want to be careful of not overdoing it and making it feel monochromatic. Lastly, I felt like the grass and the flowers are kind of standing out a little bit too much, so I'd at least try to blend it a bit with some hinted at moss or other vegetation there. Quick pass on some valleys and shadows, like underneath the belly was a little too bright, so I darkened it a bit. And there you have it, and there's the final product. I hope you found this little demo helpful, or at least somewhat enjoyable. And if you'd like to see more, don't forget to subscribe. Alright, until next time, see ya.